Defense was playing pretty well, especially after the first month of the season. And it was also a scoring defense. They were getting like a pick six or a fumble recovery, forced fumble deep in territory. They're creating turnovers in short field. So there's a lot of complementary football that the defense was providing to pick up an offense that wasn't really in sync. Same thing on special teams. Janarian Grant was a machine last year, in terms of giving the Argos field position. So, the definition of complementary football is basically when one side of the ball is not doing its job, the other side will pick it up and compensate. They were getting that last year when Chad Kelly was out. They're not getting it this year. That's the difference between last year's Argos without Kelly and this year.
What about down there in Hamilton? Are you liking what you're seeing from their quarterback play and enough from their defense?
It's funny. The first few weeks of the season, everybody was jacked up to see what Hamilton would be like because they finished really strong last year. Bo Levi Mitchell had a huge second half. They go out and sign Kenny Lawler, who's maybe the best receiver in the league. And the first 2-3 weeks, it was like, when's the show begin? Where are the fireworks? What is this? And the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's been a different show. Kenny Lawler is playing at such an exceptional level right now. I don't think of the last time we've seen a receiver in the CFL who's that dominant. And look, this guy was a big-time player in college. He played with Jared Goff at Cal, and he was a draft pick of the Seahawks, of course, former teammate of our friend Luke Wilson while he was with the Seahawks. And he's a guy who's had a lot of injuries, so he hasn't really put together that spectacular season. But the GM in Hamilton, Ted Gavaya, was the assistant GM in Winnipeg. So he knows Kenny Lawler. He knew what he was buying. He went out in the market, paid top of the value, and that's what they're getting. That's what they're getting from him. These are, again, it's not like he's wide open. This is a guy who's a contested catch guy. He's a physical receiver. He will go vertical and he will fight you for the football. That's what we've seen in him. And on the defensive side of the ball, Hamilton, their second overall pick in the draft this year was a guy out of Windsor, from the University of Windsor, named Devin Varasek. And he got a look-see in Indianapolis and was a little bit late for Ticat camp because he was kind of waiting to see if he could sign in the NFL. But look, linebacker from U Sports to the CFL, especially middle linebacker, tends to be a very rare path. Mike O'Shea did it, 30 years ago, coming out of Guelph and was starting for the Ticats. But most U Sport linebackers end up as special teams players in the CFL, a lot of them. And then a lot of them don't really good. If they do get into starting roles, it's not going to be very quickly. Devin Varasek has started 3 games at middle linebacker for Hamilton, the last 3 games. They've won them all. He's, I believe, led them in tackles every one of those games, led all players in tackles, and has a pick 6. So this is a special player that is doing things that we don't see very often. So they're getting some presence on the offensive side of the ball, getting some presence on the defensive side of the ball. I think people are feeling a lot better about the direction of the Ticats than they were the first couple weeks of the year.
Dave, you talked about knowing what you're buying, and I think the Calgary Stampeders would be pretty happy with what they got in Vernon Adams Jr. And of course, BC was in a bit of a bind last year. They had Rourke, they had Adams, and Adams moves on to Calgary. They're 4-1 now. What can you say about his play with that team this season?
I'll tell you, the Calgary Stampeders must be looking at the stars going, what are the chances that when we bottomed out, and we're ready to retool the roster and change a bunch of the coaching staff and begin that rebuilding process and look for our next guy, that Vernon Adams is available. 31 years old, seasoned, proven. If it was anybody else but Nathan Rourke that with the opportunity to go to BC, Vernon Adams would still be their quarterback. And he's not just, a dynamic player and a guy who can do all kinds of things at his position. He's also a guy who sets culture. Everywhere Vernon Adams has been, he's been a leader. He's a guy who understands this league and kind of how to conduct himself off season, in season. I remember talking to Jalen Philpott, one of the Philpott twins, who was a free agent last year after starting 3 years with Calgary, and I was talking to him about the decision to go back to the Stamps after they kind of bottomed out last year. And it was clear he'd spent a lot of conversations in the offseason with Vernon Adams. Vernon Adams arrived in Calgary and not only became the starting quarterback, but he became, the leader of the team to retain guys. And it's been dramatic. The other thing they did was, Calgary the worst record in the league last year. So you get the first overall pick. Okay, getting the first overall pick in the CFL is not like getting the first overall pick in the NFL. You're still probably picking a developmental player. You're probably still picking a guy who's not going to have an impact on your roster, till maybe late in his rookie year, maybe even year 2. Well, they took a guy named Damian Alford, who played most of his college career in Syracuse. He was at Utah last year, was hurt all year. I mean, he had, I think it was like 6 for 155 and 2 touchdowns on the weekend. Second straight game, he's had a touchdown. He's a 6'5", 6'6" guy out of Montreal. He can high point the ball. He's got speed. We don't usually see rookie Canadian receivers, splash like this in their first 2 months in the league. So, there are a few things going right in Calgary, but definitely Vernon Adams. I mean, it's such a luxury for a rebuilding team to be able to go out and find a player like that right in the heart of his prime and start to build around him.
With Dave Naylor, and obviously the reason he was available was because Nathan Rourke was on his way back to BC, and it didn't go well for Rourke last year, the transition after taking kicks at the can at the NFL and jumping around to a bunch of different spots in the NFL, obviously Jacksonville first and foremost. But the last few weeks he's looked pretty good. I mean, they just laid a beating on Struddy's Elks in his backyard in Edmonton, and he's very efficient in terms of throwing. He didn't have to run the ball because they were winning so big the other on Sunday night, I believe it was. But the previous few games, his legs look better. Like, that's what he was right now, Gunn. Before he had that really tough injury a couple years ago, like, he was a dual threat with his arm, with his legs. He looks like he's pretty close to being back to form from my standpoint. Where do you stand on Nathan Rourke and him possibly getting back to that MOP status?
I very much agree with you, Bryan. I think we saw it right in week number 1 in their first win against the Elks. And, then he has the injury the next couple of weeks. And, it's an oblique, so it's the kind of thing that takes some time to heal. And, he's taken practice in first team one day and then not the next. And that kind of in and out of the lineup thing he was working. But I thought he played very well in the game the other night. Look, I'm not surprised here. Nathan Rourke's 27 years old, so he's not a kid anymore. He's right in the heart of his prime. And look, when you come back from the National Football League in midseason, there's not much of a history of guys like really coming back and lighting it up the second half of the year. I mean, there were 3 prominent players that came back from the NFL last year. Matthew Betts came back from the Detroit Lions, BC Lions last year, didn't have a great second half. Austin Mack came back from the Atlanta Falcons to Montreal, the receiver. He didn't have a great second half, and neither did Nathan Rourke. And look, I don't know this, but I'm going to speculate that, like, Nathan Rourke's a kid who grew up in Oakville dreaming of playing in the National Football League. And, he got himself there. And once you get there in the kind of position he was in as a free agent coming out of the CFL, you need some things to break your way. I mean, it's just the way it is. Like, if Brock Purdy hadn't had everybody fall down in front of him in San Francisco, we wouldn't know who he is. I mean, they just don't make way for 7th-round picks or free agent quarterbacks. You kind of just need things to fall in your direction to get an opportunity. It never really did for Nathan. And look, I'm sure processing the end of that NFL dream, and I don't want to say it's over for him in the NFL, but the odds are unlikely that he ends up going back. It's just the longer you're here, the older you get, the less opportunity there is to make that jump. So I'm sure that was something that just emotionally was tough for him to process last year, but he's reset himself. I thought he looked kind of burned out at the end of last year, but he's really reset himself this offseason. The Lions are a bit of a work in progress, but I don't think Nathan Rourke is. I think, look, if he's